And the more I ride it, the more I realize the geometry and the unique damp feel of the chassis, relative to its light weight, is really the secret sauce to the Transition Spur. And it's easily one of the most fun and rewarding bikes that I've ever ridden, and I can see this one remaining in the stable for a really long time. But that was before I got the chance to ride a Yeti SB115, so is this the bike I should have bought? Well, let's find out. You can't talk about the SB115 without bringing up the SB100 because, well, they're essentially the same bike. To get the additional 15mm of travel, Yeti's using a longer stroke 45mm shock and a new linkage to adjust the leverage ratio to ensure proper clearance for that switch infinity movement. And speaking of the switch, it's now using a revised version with threaded stanchions to prevent them from chronically coming loose. Up front is a Fox 34 with 130mm of travel, along with wider 30mm wheels and a 2.5-inch DHF tire up front. The version I tested was a T1 that came with the full Shimano XT group set, along with their 4-piston brakes. As you'd imagine, all of these beefed up components add weight, and at almost 29 pounds, the SB115 is pushing the limits of what a country bike is supposed to be. But weight isn't everything, and how does the bike ride on the trail? Well, pretty darn good actually. If you've been following my channel, you know that I absolutely loved the SB100 when it came out. But that was over 2 years ago, and geometry has evolved quickly over that period of time. So on paper, I already dismissed the SB115 as nothing more than a recycled attempt at a country bike. But I was pleasantly surprised at how well this bike rode, especially on the descents. The rear end is noticeably more calm at speed, to the point where I felt like the Fox 34 was having a hard time keeping up. It still has that precision feel of the SB100, with just that little bit more suspension to take the edge off the big hits.
Brakes are phenomenal, but damn are they noisy. I can hear it rattling back there. I think one thing that's immediately clear is this chassis is stiffer than the Spur, for sure.
If anything, this bike made me appreciate how good the SB100 platform is. And while the geometry numbers might look dated on paper, I had a surprisingly good time on this bike. Therefore, I don't fault Yeti for keeping it around a while longer, and if I had a mold that looked half this good laying around, well, I'd want to keep using it too. But everything isn't perfect, and let's talk about climbing. And this is where it gets a little complicated. The SB115 climbs better than mid-travel bikes like the SB130, but when compared directly to bikes like the Transition Spur, I think it falls a little bit short. Like virtually all Switch Infinity bikes, there's very little shock movement when you're seated and pedaling. However, when compared to the Spur, the additional weight is noticeable, especially with those heavier wheels and tires that are spec'd on the 115. And despite the 74-degree seat-tube angle, which actually felt better than I expected, ultimately, it's not as steep as some other modern bikes, so your hips are going to be further back behind that bottom bracket. And finally, the shock tune isn't as firm as the one found on the SB100, so it doesn't have that racy feel that I recall from those out-of-the-saddle sprints. All of this adds up to a good, if not class-leading climbing performance.
If you're doing stuff really rocky, ledgy, I think I may want the SB115. It's a little bit higher off the ground. That Switch Infinity may help you slightly get that last bit of traction. Where I would pick the Spur is on kind of mixed, smoothish single track climbing. Just does seem to have a little bit more of that snappiness.
In terms of geometry, it's worth noting that the bike I rode was a size large, which is closer to, but still shorter in reach and wheelbase than my medium Transition Spur. However, sizing up better allowed me to compare these two bikes head to head, but it does come with some drawbacks, namely with its increased standover and seat-tube length, the latter of which limits your ability to run a long dropper. And at 5 feet 10 inches tall, I was just barely able to get away with the 170mm dropper slammed all the way down on the Yeti. And then of course you have the elephant in the room, which is that head tube angle. At 67.6 degrees, the Yeti is over 1.5 degrees steeper than the Spur. Now, there is no right or wrong when it comes to the ideal head tube angle, and it's going to come down to your riding style and how steep your local trails are. However, as you'd expect, the Spur rewards a rider who prefers to lean the bike in and turn a little bit more with their hips, while the Yeti has a bit more of that telepathic steering feel that many people still prefer. And the more I think about it, the more it becomes obvious that while both bikes are virtually equal in terms of capability, they go about it in different ways. The Spur takes an aggressive geometry but lightweight frame and understated component approach, while the Yeti does the opposite. It's taking a more conservative geometry, overbuilt SB100 frame, and beefing it up with components to make it more capable. And while the end result might seem similar on paper, they actually feel very different on the trail.
One thing I'll talk about also is the suspension feel. When you jump on this bike and you jump on the Spur, what's immediately noticeable to me is how the bike goes through the suspension. It's very different and it's really hard to explain. I would say the Yeti SB115 has a little bit more of that traditional trail bike feel. When you jump on that Spur, it just feels immediately different. And I think a lot of that is just really that new RockShox SID suspension, which really gives it a unique feel. That top end is just really supple, and the way the bike glides over little chatter is very different than this Fox. The Fox has a little bit more of a memory foam cushion kind of feel, whereas the RockShox is a little more active. The way it glides over the bumps is really unique. And as soon as you push in a little bit beyond that on the Spur, the bike just has this really taut, supportive feel, and you can push against it and it really kind of springs you right back. But that feeling is a little bit more lively than this bike.
So to answer the question, is the Yeti SB115 the bike I should have bought? Well, let's just say I don't have buyer's remorse. However, it was way closer than I thought it would be, and riding the SB115 was a pleasant surprise because on paper, it's not a bike I expected to like as much as I did, which got me seriously thinking about building a winter project bike, but you'll have to wait for that next time. If you take one thing away from this video, it's that bikes are so good these days and that the difference between first and last in a comparison test come down to some nitpicky details that most people aren't going to care about. In the end, buy the bike from the brand you associate with, the color you like, or heck, whatever you can get in stock right now. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Big thanks to Rhythm Bikes for making this video happen. And if you're interested in either of these bikes and you're local to the Bay Area, Chad at Rhythm has definitely got you covered. Remember, those trails don't get easier, you get better. We'll see you on the next one.